Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I'm going to show you is how I've painted Ursula Creed, the Lord Castellan of Cadia, and I had a blast doing this. This video is going to be a fair bit longer than what I normally do because we are painting a special character, but as well I'm going to talk a fair bit about the choices that I've made and the reasons why I'm doing certain things or using certain colors. So it's going to be a little bit more wandering, let's say. But if you do want a nice concise guide, well, just crank that sucker to 2 times speed and enjoy. As always, folks, all the questions? Now, as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. I'm going to split this up into 2 parts so that it covers both the base and Ursula herself. Let's get started. So before we get to painting, I actually want to talk very briefly about the assembly stage, because I'm pretty certain that the intent from the design team was to paint her in a couple of stages. The miniature itself, the instructions suggest to assemble Ursula and then glue her to the base. And there's a neat little divot here where you can very easily do that. She's got an accompanying sort of divot on her shoe, and once she's finished, she will stand on there very, very easily. So I'm pretty certain that's how they've meant for her to be assembled, and I understand that. All the same, if you have already assembled her in one great big piece and you want to paint her in one go, it's still eminently doable. It's just going to be a little bit more tricky to reach areas like the accords on the standard and maybe some of the beams on her base. But luckily, the back of the miniature is not terribly detailed herself, so if you struggle to reach that, you're not going to miss out painting anything cool. The action's all in the front here. Now, one other thing, this little macabre detail here, is that I've drilled a hole in the bottom of the neck joint, just a pin vise and a little drill, and then stuck her to my little head painting jig, which is just some hat pins pushed into a cork and then the tips cut off. She's not glued in place. That's actually going to be very easy to pull off, and because I'm not going to be doing anything too strenuous, glue's not going to be necessary. I'll be able to just wiggle that off and then pop it into the neck joint on the miniature. Now I'm doing this first of all because it will then be much easier to paint her face, but also on this miniature, the way that she's designed, her collar, both of her shirt and her jacket are quite high up. So trying to paint those, they're going to be very visible from the front, and her face is going to be in the way if I'm trying to paint them. So this time, I'm actually more worried about painting her clothes than her face. But after that little bit of extra prep work, she's going to be much easier to paint. So I've gone ahead and I have primed everything with Xandri dust. Anything will work that's similar to this. If you can get skeleton bone from the army painter, for example, don't worry too much about it being perfect. But I would suggest whatever primer you use the same basic primer that you have for the rest of the infantry in your army. It'll be a subtle difference, but sticking to that is going to make her fit with them much better. Now we're actually going to start by painting off her base. If you do want to skip ahead straight to painting Ursula, the timestamps at the bottom will help you jump to that. But I figure we'll start from the bottom and work our way up. After priming, what we're going to do is coat most of the rocks and the metalwork. I've got here dryad bark. You could spray this a darker brown if you can find a primer like that. But remember, smashed up concrete and stuff like that is never just grey. So what we're going to do is add a little bit of warmth and something which will be a little bit more interesting to look at than just spraying it grey. So the only thing we really don't need to cover is the banner pole and all that. Don't worry if you do hit it, of course, because we're going to paint that later. Just make sure that all of the scrungy metalwork and the rocks are all brown. Okay, now it's a slightly different brown. What we'll do now is to overbrush the thing with Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now, overbrushing is quite a lot like dry brushing, except we aren't taking as much paint off of our brush before we do it. The objective with dry brushing is normally just to catch the edges, whereas with overbrushing, we really just want to leave the recesses. So that deep, grimy brown is going to serve as kind of a base for what we're doing. As you see, I'm being fairly generous with the grey to make this look a little bit more like concrete and wreckage. I don't need to avoid the little metal bits specifically, but if I can, I'll dodge those with my brush. Let's go for it. Nice and quick. I'm pretty much done there. Then after our overbrush, I am going to dry brush it, and this time I'm going to use Tyrant Skull. Now this is a light beige color. You've probably got it if you are painting Cadians in the Cadian 8th style. And you'll see it looks quite a lot different. It's a little more yellow than the concrete, but it catches these edges really nicely. It gives us a lot of sort of dusty definition. You can be fairly careless with it, to be perfectly honest. The more grubby and random it looks, the better. And when we shade this, it's going to bring it all together and give it a similar sort of muted, grimy palette. But take your time, dry brush all of the stones. Now that'll be a bit more interesting. Remember that nothing is ever just black or grey, there's always a bit of colour to something. Now another job for an awful scrunkly old brush is some riser rust, and this is going to look, I swear, awful going on. But once you've taken most of it off your brush, instead of dry brushing this on, it is a dry paint, but just stipple it over the brown work for the metal. Try and avoid, don't worry too much if you do hit some of the stones that you've painted. We don't need to be terribly fussy, but we're going to use this to pick out the metal work. So take a bit of time, and you can be fairly generous with this, mostly using it to cover up any of the grey that we might have gotten on the metal. Now by applying that in sort of stabbing motions, what you'll get is a little speckly, like a textured surface to it, which works quite well. Finally, for the metal, we're going to use some Necron compound and just dry brush along some of the edges of the metal to make it look like parts of it have been exposed to the elements for a little bit longer. So we've got nice, grimy metal. This is still going to look super bright right now, but remember, as always, shading is coming. Okay, now what I'm going to turn to is Iron Hand Steel and paint in the banner pole. We're going to use a couple of these colors again later, so hold on to your silver colors. Now we are going to use this later too, so it's a good one to have. Just take your time and don't worry if you hit the beams, but try not to hit the stones. Now painting the gold sections on her standard, I'm going to do this in 2 stages. And this is kind of an experiment, so if it goes wrong, I'm going to cut this part. We'll start with Retributor Armor. I'm going to use this for all of the gold. But what I have here is a flat brush, and we're basically going to overbrush the gold on this section here with the Cadia, because I've put a little bit of the Dryad bark from earlier into the background. I want to see if I can just go over it a few times and pick out the lettering. Hi, yeah, brilliant, cool, okay. I shouldn't laugh so much, but sometimes you do something and it works, and it's very pleasing. So I'm just going to very lightly go over Cadia a few times with this flat brush. All right, and then the rest of the gold will apply using just a normal brush, something like a medium layer brush. I'm using a synthetic one here from Warlord Games, but anything that works for you will do. Just take your time as you come near to that funky little Cadia. Try not to paint in the brown. Now the temptation will be to go straight to the white on this here icon, but because we've also got the helmet down on the base, which is going to have a little bit of white on it, we'll paint that first. Now the painting guide from Games Workshop recommends Vulcan Green for the Cadian 8th armor. What I've got here is actually US Dark Green from Vallejo, and it's almost exactly the same color. It just covers a lot better, I find. So this is what I'm using. Pop a little bit of this over the helmet. And then for that white, I'm going to use Corax White. Now some folks have a lot of trouble with this. What I recommend is a little bit of Lamian Medium the first time you open it, and pop an agitator in there, and you'll see it covers pretty well. If you're still not convinced, you just don't like using it, or you can't get a decent result out of it, something like, Ulthuan Grey, a couple of coats of that with then a white over the top will also work quite well. But yeah, this, as you can see, is covering just fine. Then after a couple of coats of that, the last detail we really need to paint in is the rope that's hanging from here. This is Mephiston Red that I'm using, because when we shade it, I think it's going to look better. You could use something like Galvorbak Red if you wanted a more sort of velvet rope finish to it, but I want something a little bit brighter myself. Once you finish with that, you can go ahead and do any last minute tidy up that you need to at this stage, and then I'm going to go ahead and shade the base. Now I've got here Agrax Earthshade, and I am using this straight from the pot. Ordinarily I tend to thin this down, but in this case I really don't think we'll need to. Just apply this over everything that we've done, Make sure that you are really jamming it into the recesses. And then, same as always, once we've finished, we'll leave this for about half an hour to dry. And there we go, that's now pretty much finished. What I'm going to do much later on, like once we pass the stage of varnishing the whole miniature, I'm going to add little bits of grass on the base so it's a wee bit more visually interesting and it's tied into the environment a bit more. But for now, the painting's really done. What I am going to do is brighten up the white with just a little bit of fresh Corax white. And remember, of course, to leave just a little bit of that shaded stuff in the recesses. So there we go. There are one or two things left that I do want to do to the base, but we're going to finish those off as the last parts of the entire miniature. So we're going to put that aside, and now, at last, we'll start on Ursula. Alright, so looking at Ursula here, what I've done was to trim a little bit of the peg on her foot to make it flat, and just a dab of super glue on both boots so that she's stuck to this base. Make it a little easier to hold her. I am going to dab in a little bit of Xandri dust just to make sure that her trousers are still the right color. You don't want to sort of saturate her when you're priming her, but that won't take long to do. Now, speaking of that green, since her coat is the next layer up, we're going to turn straight to that. For this, what I'm going to use is Death Guard green. I don't really think there's a correct answer here. Because we're going to be painting her so that her uniform is reminiscent of, but doesn't necessarily match the other guys around her, any green will work here. I think Death Guard green is going to look work well for that kind of army man green finish. But I mean, Lauren Forest would probably also be quite a good base color here. What I'm going to do is just jam in a couple of coats of Death Guard green. You see I'm not being careful around the belt or what have you, because, well, we start from the bottom so that we can tidy as we go. Now, 2 coats later, we've got a nice solid green, and don't forget the rips in her jacket. These holes in the back here just base coat the uniform underneath. We'll move on now to the next layer up, and what I've got is Mephiston red. We're going to paint in the sash here. If we do this now, again, we can splash over onto the jacket. The only thing we're trying to avoid is her coat, that she's got coat, jacket, the green stuff. We don't want to hit the green. Whereas with the other stuff, it's not much of a problem. So base coat this now with a bit of Mephiston red. Now that's still relatively easy to reach everything. I have splashed a little on her jacket, but I'm not too concerned. Now her breastplate here is the next section that we'd paint, because again, we want to get to that before we have to paint the jacket. But the box art has her wearing a silver breastplate, and I'd suggest turn then to Iron Hand Steel, and you could also paint in the blade at the same time, but I'm not going to do that. What I want to do is to use the same armor color as the helmet that's on her base. I want to tie her in with the Cadian 8th a little bit more, so yeah, I'm going to go with green. I am using US Dark Green again from Vallejo, but of course Vulcan Green would be what you could turn to if you wanted to do it according to the Warhammer TV guide for the Cadians. Now, if you paint the breastplate in silver, it won't matter too much. You can just paint straight over the top of the skull. Because I've painted it green, I've tried to avoid it. I'm now going to use Retributor armor, and I'm going to base coat the gold details. So obviously the great big whack-in skull there, and a couple of other bits, like the, I don't know what this is called. Rod of being big, huge Castellan, I guess. And I'm also going to paint in the power section on her sword with this. Alright, now finally we can start applying some colour to her jacket. I have Rakarth flesh, and I'm going to paint the turnbacks, and as well, any areas that are going to be gold, like that trim she's got, paint those with this Rakarth flesh now as well. You do not need to be careful on the sleeves and what have you, but of course when you come near colours you've already done, slow down a little. Remember as well that the inside of her jacket being flicked back on these rips, just base coat a little bit of that there as well. I'm going to paint in the trim now, and on the box art she's got this kind of non-metallic gold thing going on here. I'm not going to go that way because I kind of feel like a gold thread might be a bit much, so instead I'm using here Avalanche Sunset. You'll see this covers very nicely over that little quick splash of Rakarth flesh, and you don't have to be too careful with this still. It's going to look super dark going on, but keep the faith. We're going to highlight this later. Now when it comes to the leather of her belt and her holsters, you could use something like rhinox hide, which is going to make her look quite similar to the regular infantry. I've got here Castellan flesh because this is a little bit lighter and just a touch warmer, and I like the idea that her gear would be custom made. So a couple of coats of this, first of all over the holsters, and then anywhere that you can see the belt poking through, take a second to get in there. I had managed to forget that her belt buckle was supposed to be gold as well. Whoops! But we are now coming to the last couple of base coats. I've got here Cadian flesh tone, and I'm going to apply this to her hands, and of course, lurking over there on that macabre little jig, I'm going to paint her face with this too. This will probably take a couple of coats over Xandri dust, but it will look just fine when we're done. And now, finally, we'll get to painting her jacket. Now, for this, I'm going to use a Vallejo color. This is German Camo Black Brown. Now, the Heavy Metal team, I'm pretty sure they've used a mix, featuring black and maybe dryad bark, but you'll see, oh my goodness, this stuff is just perfect. Really nice and dark, but still with a little bit of rich warmth to it, which is super pleasant. This is my go-to for really dark brown leather, and yeah, you'll see it covers in really nicely too. So if you did want to make this, I would probably suggest from the Citadel range, maybe black into Rhinox hide, roughly 50-50, give that a shot. But if you can pick up the Vallejo range, this is a paint well worth having. Now isn't that just the perfect color? It is such a nice brown, really deep and rich, and it looks so much like the box art without having to mix anything. So, like I said, if you can find it, definitely pick that up. I'm going to use now Vallejo's black for just a couple of things. Her boots, first of all, and also the little rod on her, I still don't know the name of this, the donking stick. Now with that done, we'll use that Iron Hand steel again and paint in any metallic details. Things like her sword, this little dealy bopper, I mean unless you want to paint that in a bone color. Buttons and badges and what have you that you haven't done yet, silver those up. And then finally, that is all of the base coats on the body done. I have also painted in a little bit of Mephiston red on the gems on the donk stick, and I don't know, I don't think you necessarily need to, but I'm sticking pretty close to the box, so I've done that. The last thing to do now is to base coat her hair, and for this I've got Steel Legion Drab. Ordinarily I'd recommend start from one side quite close to her face and draw your brush away from it. Now once at last that is finished, cruise back and do any tidy up that you need to. I have touched up a little bit of the yellow and some of the brown around her shoulders, but now we're ready to shade her. What I've got here, this is a pot mixed up. This is Agrax Earthshade and Lamian Medium in equal measures. And it doesn't matter if it's the old shade or the new shade, because once you jam enough medium in there, it's going to behave exactly the same way. Now the reason why I've thinned it out like this is I don't want the shade to completely darken the miniature. We are going to alter the colors a little bit, obviously, but I just want the shading, really. I don't want it to be grungy and brown like the base was, using the straight stuff. So with our mix here, I'm going to start applying this over the entire miniature. Try and keep your brush moving in the same direction as you apply it. It's not always going to be possible, like something you have to jam in there sometimes. But for large, flatter areas, keep your brush moving the same way and you'll find you end up with a slightly smoother finish as a result. So what I'm going to do now is cover the whole miniature, do a face as well with this, and yeah, we'll come back in about half an hour once this has dried. Now, once at last the shade is dried, you're going to have something which looks, hopefully, like this. There are a couple of things that I'm going to do very quickly off camera, which is to go back over, first of all, most of the skin with that Cadian flesh tone again. I'm going to leave just a little bit of the shaded stuff in the recesses, and same too with the Death Guard green on her uniform in the areas that I can reach, just in the front here. Not too bothered about her collar. Once you go back over with that Cadian flesh tone, you'll see I have left the very darkest recesses, but she looks a little bit more human. We'll take now Kislev flesh, and we are going to paint over most of her face with this, leaving just a little bit of these shaded areas to really accentuate like her cheekbones And yeah, that's really about it. Otherwise, most of this is going to be Kislev flesh. I do recommend when painting a face like this, whatever color you've done the base color for the skin, don't paint the bottom lip, which is going to look a little strange as we go, but once we finish, it will make a lot more sense. So take your time around details that you do not want to obscure, but then for forehead and cheeks and what have you, you can move a little bit faster. As you'll see, that looks quite severe. Unfortunately, there's not really an easy way to show you how to do that on camera. Little bits of paint on your brush at a time, you might have seen, and just do little lines as you go. And remember, if you do end up making a mistake, you sort of splurge an area, you fill in a recess, don't worry, just grab yourself some Agrax Earthshade or some Cadian Flesh Tone, and you can fill those in again and then go back to your highlight. This is part of the reason why keeping your paint nice and thin is a good idea while painting faces. We'll go now to Flayed One Flesh, which is nice and bright. And this time what we're going to do is some of the real highlights. So places like her cheekbones, her chin, and if you've got a steady hand, particularly the little gaps under her eyes, away you go. This is particularly where checking out other faces, or maybe the box art will come in handy. You can really paint a little bit of expression into her here. Okay, now the final thing I'm going to do highlighting wise, and really you could stop here, like at no point do you have to go as far as this, but I like painting faces, and if you're painting guardsmen you're going to get a lot of practice, so a bit of fun for this. Tiny wee smidgen of Screaming Skull, and I'm going to use this just at extreme edges to give her a little bit more expression. And now we'll go back a little bit more simply. I've got here Baneblade Brown, and I'm going to paint just a few lines into her hair to make it look a little lighter at the edges. If you'd like to accentuate the bottom lip a little bit more, then what you could do would be to take a splash of Carroburg Crimson or similar, even Reichland Flesh Shade, and just go over it very thinly with your brush. I don't think you're going to need to, because that little base coat, it looks more natural, but up to you. So looking now back to a uniform, everything's a little bit simpler. I've got Nurgling Green, and I'm going to do just a little bit on the jacket here to lighten this up. Coat, jacket, undershirt, what do you call this thing? Goodness me. Just little lines to help define some of the way that this is flowing. Nurgling Green will look quite light going on, but after a couple of seconds as it dries, it'll tone down, look a little more natural. Don't need to do very much of this at all though. And then what we'll use is Ungor Flesh to do the gold trim, or the yellow trim rather. This is a funny old colour because I don't use it for very much, but I am always really pleased when I do have it because it looks fabulous over yellow to give it this kind of worn gold thread appearance. So little bits of this, especially at creases in the wings particular here, will look very cool. From that point, if you want to take that a little bit further, you can touch up the corners even more with something like Ushabti Bone. That will look quite good, but I'm happy with that, and I don't want to spend forever painting her. What we'll move to now is Wild Rider Red, and I'm going to use this to paint just a few little lines on the sash here. This is going to be super bright going on, but same as with the other things, we're really looking just for a little bit to get some depth to what we're doing. So see a tiny bit of paint on my brush at a time will help you keep control of what you're doing too. With a little bit of Flayed One Flesh, I'm going to highlight this scroll work here, and I am going to cover over most of it with this and leave the shaded areas in the recesses. Now I'll be honest up front, I'm not brave enough to try writing Creed on here, but if you've got a steadier hand and stronger nerves than I do, then you might try that. If you do decide you want to highlight the leather, then a little bit of Scrag Brown, watered down quite thinly, will work well for this. Let's try and catch the edges and let that colour build until it's a little bit stronger where you want it to be. Now to highlight the gold, what I would recommend, it's going to come up on screen, is Liberator Gold. But I've run out, so I've actually mixed my Retributor Armour with a little bit of Stormhost Silver and gotten much the same colour. It is a little bit more brassy than I would like, but honestly, I'd rather have her painted and finished than have to order that paint before I can finish this video, so we're gonna improvise. And then with some neat Stormhost silver, I'm just going to touch in the very edges of any metallic bits, like her pistols, buttons if I fancy it, and so forth. Now Stormhost silver can split while it's sitting on the palette if you're not careful, so just intermittently go back and mix it together while you're using it. Now finally, when it comes to highlighting her old coat, what I've got here is a mix of the base color, so this is German camo black-brown, and a little bit of the Rakarth flesh from the interior. What I'd say is just mix it in a little bit at a time, add Rakarth flesh until you're happy with the finish, and this will give you a nice faded version of that brown to use as a highlight. Because it is quite a big jacket, I would recommend don't go crazy with it, because otherwise you're going to overpower the brown very quickly, but that's going to be just plenty. The color's quite nice for that. So once I'm done with this, what I'll do is pop a varnish on her. I'm going to use Varnish Plus from Instar, which I quite thoroughly recommend. And then, yeah, get a look at what she looks like when she's all finished. And so, there at last, Ursula Creed is complete. Now, I really enjoyed painting her. She was a lot of work, but I think if you're going to put a special character on the table, well, you want to spend that little bit of extra time. Once it's painted, it is painted forever. So despite her taking a lot longer than I thought she might, I'm still really happy with that result. There's a lot from here that I could still do, highlighting the gems, for example, and a little bit more of her coat maybe, but honestly, for what she's going to do on the table, I think she looks great. I'm really happy with that. And the results, yeah, awesome. So, as always, folks, hopefully there was something there interesting to you. Thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. You folks are the ones who let me pick up Ursula Creed. Now, if you've got any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and my Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for all of that time, and you folks enjoy the rest of your day.